The coffee maker in the 38th floor kitchen had been broken for 6 days, and I was the only one who seemed to care enough to actually fix it. Not fix it personally. I'd submitted 3 maintenance requests, followed up twice by phone, and finally called the building management company directly and quoted the specific clause in our commercial lease about functional common area appliances. The machine was repaired by Thursday afternoon. That's what I did. I found the pressure point in any system and applied exactly the right amount of force. Adrian Voss noticed things like that. I'd come to understand after 14 months as his executive assistant, both his greatest quality and the most unsettling thing about him. He never said anything directly. He just observed. You'd catch him watching from across the office. Gray-green eyes tracking some small detail. The way you reorganized the filing system before a major audit. The specific tone you used when managing a difficult vendor call. How you preempted a scheduling conflict 3 weeks before it would have become anyone else's problem. Then he'd file it away somewhere in that precise, unhurried mind of his, and occasionally, weeks later, he'd reference it in passing. Casually, like he'd been thinking about it the whole time. I'd been hired through a recruiter who specialized in placements for senior executives at major Canadian firms. Adrian ran Voss Capital Partners out of their Bay Street office in Toronto. Private equity, infrastructure investment, the kind of work where a misread clause in a funding agreement could cost clients 8 figures and cost him his reputation. His previous assistant had lasted 4 months. The one before that, 7. The recruiter had warned me, diplomatically, that Mr. Voss had high standards and a low tolerance for inefficiency. What she hadn't mentioned was that he was 39, that he had the kind of focused intensity that made junior analysts physically nervous, or that he sometimes stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking Bay Street for 10 full minutes, without speaking, apparently just thinking, and that this was somehow more unnerving than if he'd been shouting. I'd stopped being nervous around him somewhere around month 3, when I'd corrected a calculation error in a term sheet he'd already sent for review, and he'd looked at me for a long moment and said quietly, "Good catch." Not effusively, not thank you, not great work, just good catch. Like I was an equal who'd done what was expected of an equal. I'd decided then that I could work with this man for a very long time. My name is Lily Brennan. I grew up in Guelph, studied business administration at Waterloo, moved to Toronto at 24 with $2,000, a very good reference letter, and the specific kind of stubbornness my mother called determination and my brother called annoying. I was 29 when I started at Voss Capital. I'd be 31 before any of what I'm about to tell you actually happened, which is to say, it built slowly, the way most things that matter do. The Tuesday it all shifted started the same way every Tuesday started. I was at my desk by 7:45, which was before the official start of business, but after the building's espresso bar on the concourse level opened. Because I'd learned that the line became unreasonable by 8:15 and Adrian's morning briefing was at 8:30, and he needed his coffee, a flat white with 1 sugar, in the specific blue ceramic travel mug he'd had since apparently forever, waiting on his desk when he walked in. This was not in my job description. I'd started doing it somewhere around month 2 because it was efficient, and efficiency was the organizing principle of this office. I was reconciling the Q3 investor report when I noticed the delivery notification on the security desk log. We used a building-wide system for all deliveries, courier packages, mail. Anything that came through the lobby got logged before being sent up. I reviewed the log each morning as part of opening procedures, because twice in the past year packages addressed to Adrian had been misrouted to the law firm on the 22nd floor, which had caused actual problems. The log showed a delivery addressed to me. Personal, not business my name, the office address, marked as a floral arrangement from a shop I didn't recognize called Bloom & Co. on Queen West. I hadn't ordered flowers. I had no reason to receive flowers at work. My birthday was in March, and it was currently October. I went down to the lobby at 8:10 before Adrian arrived and found them waiting at the security desk, an arrangement of pale pink peonies and white ranunculus in a tall glass vase, elaborate and expensive-looking, with a small card tucked into the stems. The card said, "For the woman who makes everything run." I stood there in the lobby holding this card, genuinely baffled. I ran through my mental catalog of everyone in my life whose name started with T, my university roommate Tessa, who was currently living in Vancouver and would have texted me, my cousin Tyler, who communicated exclusively through memes, Thomas Egan, from the marketing firm we'd worked with on an investor event last spring, who had seemed friendly in that general, pleasant colleague way, and whose name I'd forgotten until right now. I carried the flowers upstairs, set them on the corner of my desk because there was nowhere else to put them, and returned to the investor report. Adrian walked in at 8:28. He paused at my desk, not long, barely a second, before continuing into his office. 2 minutes later, his voice came through the intercom. "Lily, the Q3 report, can you bring it in?" I brought it in. He was standing at the window with his coffee, his back to me, which was the thinking posture. "Sit," he said, which meant he wanted to talk through something rather than just receive documents. I sat. "The receivables section," he said, still not turning. "Walk me through your reconciliation logic." This was the test. Adrian didn't ask questions he didn't already know the answers to. He was checking whether I'd caught the same inconsistency he had, or whether I'd missed it and needed to be told. I walked him through it. He turned to face me when I got to the part where I'd flagged the discrepancy in the August close, and something in his expression settled, the particular form of satisfaction that passed for approval in this office. "Good," he said. "Schedule 30 minutes with Davies for Thursday. We'll need to loop in the auditor before this goes to the LPs." I was making a note when he added, without any particular inflection, "The flowers." I looked up. "They were addressed to you." It wasn't a question. He'd clearly seen the delivery log this morning before I had, which meant he'd been in earlier than his usual 8:15 arrival. I filed that away. "Yes. I don't know who sent them. There's no return address. There's a card, just an initial." I paused. "It's probably nothing." He held my gaze for a moment in a way that I couldn't read. "Have them moved to the kitchen if they're a distraction. Better light in there anyway." He turned back to the window. Meeting over, I moved the flowers to the kitchen. They weren't a distraction. But I thought about the card. Tea, more than I should have for the rest of the day. My colleague Divya from the investor relations team came by at lunch, visibly delighted. "Okay, you need to tell me everything about the peonies. Everyone's seen them. Sarah from compliance is convinced they're from Adrian." "They're absolutely not from Adrian." "How do you know?" "Because Adrian expresses appreciation through not firing me, and occasionally saying good work in a tone slightly warmer than his usual tone. He's not a flower sender. Maybe that's exactly what a secret flower sender wants you to think." She raised her eyebrows meaningfully. "Divya, I'm just saying, I've seen how he looks at you when you're not looking. He looks at me like I'm an employee he finds competent. That is a normal professional expression. It's really not." I went back to my desk. The afternoon was busy enough that I almost forgot about it. Almost. But there was something about an anonymous gesture directed at your workplace that sat differently than one directed at your home. It felt deliberate, calculated, designed for an audience, or at least designed knowing there would be one. I thought about Thomas Egan. We'd worked together for about 3 weeks during the planning phase of Voss Capital's annual investor dinner at the Ritz-Carlton last April. He was organized, quick to respond, good at logistics. We'd had coffee twice in the lobby of this building when coordinating vendor contracts. He'd been pleasant. I hadn't thought of him once since the event wrapped. Why would he send flowers now, 6 months later? And why here, to my office? The more I thought about it, the less it felt like a crush, and the more it felt like something else, something I didn't have a name for yet. Adrian called me into his office at 5:15, which was unusual. End-of-day conversations typically happened by 4:30. "Close the door," he said. I did. He was at his desk, a file open in front of him, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at me with that particular direct quality that I'd never fully gotten used to, the kind that made you feel like he was solving a problem you didn't know existed. "Thomas Egan," he said. I blinked. "He worked on the investor dinner last spring, event planning firm." "Why? Do you have an ongoing relationship with him?" "No. We worked together professionally for about 3 weeks. I haven't spoken to him since April." Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's been in contact with 2 other firms in our portfolio in the past 4 months, asking questions about internal processes, client relationships. Investment timelines, he paused, framed as business development conversations. I felt the shift in the room, the way the air changes when something you thought was simple turns out not to be. You think the flowers are from him. I think the timing is worth noting. I can't imagine what I'd have that would be useful to him. Adrian's expression didn't change. You know our investor calendar for the next 18 months. You've processed the preliminary terms on the Northgate acquisition. You have a working understanding of our LP relationships and their individual priorities. He said it flatly, as if reading items off a list. That's not nothing, Lily. My name sounded different when he said it in that particular tone. Not formal, not cold, just exact. I've never told anyone anything about our internal operations, I said. I know that. No hesitation. He believed me before I'd finished the sentence, which is why I'm telling you this rather than simply handling it myself. I thought about the card. For the woman who makes everything run. Not I think you're beautiful or I'd love to take you to dinner. For the woman who makes everything run. The compliment was specific, operational. He knows what I do here, I said slowly. He had 3 weeks of access to our office and a reasonably good eye for how organizations function. Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He would have noticed you. There was something in the way he said that. Something that wasn't quite professional, but passed quickly enough that I wasn't sure I'd heard it correctly. What do you want me to do? I asked. Nothing yet. I want to understand his angle first. If he makes direct contact, by any channel, I want to know immediately. I nodded slowly, and if I'd responded to the flowers without knowing any of this, you wouldn't have. I looked at him. That's a lot of confidence. You're careful, he said simply. You notice things. Coming from Adrian Voss, that was approximately the equivalent of a standing ovation. I went home to my apartment in Leslieville, ground floor of a Victorian semi, exposed brick, small backyard that I'd optimistically planted with tomatoes the previous spring and that had produced exactly 4 tomatoes before the squirrels intervened, and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The contact request came 11 days later. Not flowers this time, a LinkedIn message, carefully worded. Thomas Egan, expressing that he'd enjoyed working together on the investor dinner, mentioning that he was exploring some new business opportunities in the financial services event space, wondering if I'd be open to coffee, to catch up and share perspectives on the industry. Perfectly innocent on its face, the kind of message that got sent every day by people with genuine professional intentions. I stared at it for a long time. I forwarded it to Adrian without responding. He called me into his office within 10 minutes. He'd clearly already spoken to someone, because there was a controlled urgency to his manner that was different from his usual measured pace. Don't respond yet, he said. I need to make some calls. To whom? He looked at me across his desk. For a moment, I thought he was going to give me one of his standard need-to-know answers. Then he seemed to make a decision. Egan's firm has been flagged by the OSC for a preliminary inquiry. Nothing public yet, nothing charged. But someone is looking at whether they've been acquiring non-public information about pending transactions in the financial sector. He paused. Your name appears in the preliminary materials as a potential contact. The floor felt unsteady for a moment. I haven't done anything. I know. He came around the desk. The first time in 14 months I could remember him doing that, closing the physical distance between us, and stood close enough that I had to look up slightly to maintain eye contact. You are not under investigation. You're identified as someone this firm has been attempting to cultivate. That's a meaningful distinction. But if I'd responded to the flowers, if I'd had coffee with him, you didn't. I almost did. I almost messaged Divya to ask if she thought it would be weird to reach out. I heard my own voice and recognized that it was steadier than I felt. I decided against it because the card felt impersonal. Something moved through his expression. Quickly, then gone. I need you to do something that will feel uncomfortable. I already knew what was coming. It was the logical move, the same move I would have recommended in any scenario where you needed documented proof of intent. You want me to respond to him. I want you to accept the coffee meeting. Act uncertain, slightly curious. Give him the impression you might be open to his approach without committing to anything. He was watching me carefully. With full support behind you. I'll have legal brief you. You'll be wired. I'll know where you are every second. You've clearly already planned this. I planned contingencies. I hoped you'd refuse and we'd find another way, but I won't refuse." He was quiet for a moment. "No, I didn't think you would." Something crossed his expression. Not quite frustration, not quite admiration. "You're about to tell me this is the smart play. It's the only play that ends this without someone getting quietly warned off and simply trying again 6 months from now with a different approach." I met his gaze. "I understand the risk. I'd like to understand the full picture first. I'll tell you everything." "You said that about the Northgate acquisition in March." The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. "This is different." "I know." He briefed me over the next 2 hours. By the end of it, I understood that Thomas Egan wasn't working alone. He was part of a larger arrangement involving a competitor fund that had been trying to get ahead of Voss Capital's acquisition timeline for over a year. The investor dinner had given them access to the office, and I'd been identified as an unwitting point of contact. The flowers in the LinkedIn message were the beginning of what would likely have become a slow, patient campaign of relationship building, designed to extract information piece by piece. "He's not a bad person," Adrian said at some point. "He's a person making choices that will end his career if they're documented." "Very philosophical of you. My grandfather used to say you learn more about someone from the problems they create than the successes they claim." He paused. He also said that, but in Polish, which makes it sound wiser. It was the most personal thing he'd said to me in 14 months. I held it carefully, the way you hold something you don't want to drop. The coffee meeting was at a cafe on Front Street, the kind of place with exposed ductwork and locally roasted single ingredients and prices that Toronto had somehow collectively decided were normal. I wore a silk blouse I'd bought specifically because it didn't look like something I'd wear to work. Intentional signals mattered. And arrived 3 minutes late, which I'd calculated was the right amount to seem unhurried without being inconsiderate. Adrian's legal contact, a woman named Brennan, who I privately found formidably competent, had briefed me the previous afternoon. I knew what questions to deflect, what kind of vagueness to perform, how to seem thoughtful without seeming guarded. I knew there was a small recording device in my bag. I knew that one of Adrian's associates was sitting near the window, with a laptop and a flat white. Thomas Egan was already there when I arrived. He looked exactly as I remembered, approachable, carefully put together, the kind of handsome that reads as trustworthy. He stood when he saw me, which was either genuinely good manners or performed good manners, and at this point I wasn't sure the distinction mattered. "Lily, thank you so much for making time." Warm smile, easy confidence. "I know Bay Street schedules can be brutal." "They can," I agreed, sitting across from him. "But I was curious about the flowers." He looked slightly self-conscious. "I know it was an unusual gesture for a professional contact. I hope it wasn't unwelcome." "It was unexpected," I said carefully. "I wasn't sure what to make of the Thomas. Obviously you." Although he smiled. "I did wonder if you'd figure it out or if you'd think it was someone mysterious. I entertained both options." He laughed. It was a good laugh. I noted that and filed it away as something that probably worked on people who didn't know to look for it. The conversation built slowly, the way these things do when someone is good at what they're doing. He asked about my background, seemed genuinely interested in my answers, shared just enough about his own work to seem open without revealing anything strategic. The pivot came about 20 minutes in, casual and smooth, wrapped in a question about how different firms managed investor relations during major transaction periods. "It must be interesting," he said, "to see how a firm like Voss Capital manages the communication balance, keeping LPs informed without overloading them during something like a major acquisition." "It's a delicate balance," I said, vague and slightly sympathetic, the tone of someone who has opinions but is weighing whether to share them. "I imagine the timing questions alone are complex." He leaned forward slightly. "Like, when does the broader team get looped in? Is there a threshold, a deal stage, where disclosure starts to flow more widely?" There it was, not crude, not obvious, genuinely well constructed. I understood why this approach worked on people who weren't expecting it. "Thomas," I said, and let a small pause sit there. "I think I need to be honest with you." His expression shifted. Something calculating appeared behind the warmth. "Of course." I did a little digging after the flowers arrived, not because I was suspicious of you specifically, but because I'm careful, and an anonymous gesture to my office from someone I hadn't spoken to in 6 months felt worth understanding. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup. The OSC filing isn't public, but a lawyer I know mentioned your firm had come up in a preliminary inquiry context. The color didn't quite leave his face, but something behind his eyes went very still. I'm not recording this conversation, I said, which was technically true, in the sense that I was not personally recording it. And I'm not here to confront you. I genuinely don't think you're a bad person, Thomas. I think you've been working inside a situation that made this approach feel justified, and I think you're going to realize very soon that it isn't worth it. He was quiet for a long moment. What does Voss know? Enough. I stood, picked up my bag. I'd talk to your own legal counsel before doing anything else. That's genuine advice, not a threat. I left him at the table. Outside on Front Street, the October air was cold enough that I could see my own breath, and I walked half a block before I felt my hands start to shake. My phone rang. Adrian's number. You went off script, he said. I improved the script. Silence. Then are you okay? The question was simple and direct, and it hit somewhere unexpected. In 14 months, he'd never asked me that. Not in those words. Not in that tone. The one that had nothing professional in it at all. I'm fine, I said. A little shaky. Give me 5 minutes. I have a car 2 blocks from you. Neil's driving. I know where the King Street car stops, Adrian Lilly. His voice was quiet. Please. I took the car. He was in his office when I arrived, standing by the windows in the thinking posture. But when I walked in, he turned immediately, which he didn't always do. He looked at me the way you look at something you were worried about, and are relieved to find intact. You confronted him directly, he said. I redirected the conversation in a way that accomplished the objective and avoided him incriminating himself on a recording he didn't consent to. I sat in the chair across from his desk. Our lawyer gets her documentation from the pattern of contact, not from one ambiguous cafe conversation. He's going to do exactly what I told him to do, talk to his own counsel, and that process will generate the paper trail that the OSC needs. He stared at me. It's the cleaner ending, I said. Less adversarial. Better for everyone, including you, if this firm isn't named in a sensational securities investigation that generates 3 weeks of financial press coverage. You thought about the press angle. I think about most things. He was quiet for a long time. Then he moved around the desk, and I realized he was going to do the thing again, close the distance, and I made myself stay still and not look away. You could have been at risk, he said. If I'd misread him, if he'd, but you hadn't. I might have, Adrian. I looked up at him. You've been watching this situation for weeks. You know how to read people. You wouldn't have let me walk into something genuinely dangerous. Something moved through his expression that I'd never seen there before. It wasn't the controlled approval I'd catalogued over 14 months. It was something rawer, less composed. I've been watching you for 14 months, he said. Not just this situation. The air in the room changed. I know. The words came out quieter than I intended. I've noticed. He looked at me for a long moment. That probably should have been handled differently. Watching your employees carefully is part of running an organization. That's not what I mean, and you know it. I did know it. I'd known it for a while, in the way you know something you've decided not to examine, because examining it would require you to make a decision, and you're not sure you're ready for the consequences. Divya knew it. Probably half the office knew it. I'd been the last holdout, mostly because I was good at finding logical explanations for things that had no particular logical explanation. He watched me with a particular coffee order. He remembered, unbidden, that I took the Yonge line home, and once when the subway was suspended, had called Niall to make sure I got back to Leslieville before the ice storm hit, framed entirely as a security concern. He reviewed the background check on a client's new associate who'd been in the office 3 times and made conversation with me at the espresso bar. I had attributed all of it to operational thoroughness. I don't think, Adrian said carefully, that I've been particularly subtle. You've been exactly as subtle as someone who is very controlled and also not remotely subtle. That got me the corner of the mouth movement again, slightly more visible than usual. That's a paradox. You're a paradox. He sat on the edge of his desk, which was the most informal I'd ever seen him in this space. I should tell you something. Okay, I've worked with a lot of people who were good at their jobs. He said it in the deliberate way he said things he'd thought through carefully. Competence is not actually rare, despite what people claim. What's rare is competence combined with integrity, combined with the specific willingness to tell me when I'm wrong without making it a production. He paused. You've done that 7 times in 14 months. Of course you counted. The 3rd time, you remember? The Morgan Stanley meeting. I wanted to push the timeline on the Harbor Front deal. You were going to cost yourself the Anchor LP. I was. And you put a single-page memo on my desk that laid out exactly why, without a word of face-saving language or hedging. He was looking at me steadily. I've thought about that memo a lot. About what it takes to write something like that and hand it to someone like me. It takes knowing you'd actually read it. Yes. Something in his voice went different. That's what I mean. Somewhere along the way you decided I was worth the risk of being honest with. That's not nothing, Lily. The room was quiet except for the sound of Bay Street 38 floors below. I've made some decisions about how I want to handle the next part of this, he said. The Egan situation? I meant us. He said it without flinching, with the same directness he applied to everything. But yes, the Egan situation will resolve. The OSC will do what they do. Our firm will be protected. That part I know how to manage, he paused. This part I'm considerably less certain about. You seem certain. I'm not. I know what I want. I don't know if it's... He stopped. I don't have a clean answer for the power dynamic questions. You work for me. That's real, and it creates complications that aren't solved by good intentions. I appreciated that he'd said it. Most people didn't say it, didn't acknowledge the thing that was actually the problem. I've thought about that too, I said. For a while, actually. And I think the answer is that I'd need to transition out of this specific role. Not immediately, not dramatically. But if we're... I paused, organizing my thoughts. I can't be both. It would compromise my own judgment and yours, and neither of us would be comfortable with compromised judgment. He was watching me with that careful attention. You've already thought through the logistics. I tend to. I know. The warmth in his voice was quiet and completely genuine. I've built a small consulting practice in my head around your skill set approximately 4 times in the last year. You've been planning my exit? I've been planning how you'd succeed outside this office, he said. There's a difference. It was such an Adrian thing to say. Plan the contingency for something you want before you've admitted you want it. Build the framework while pretending it's purely theoretical. I stood up. He stood too, which put us very close together. The closest we'd been in any context that wasn't a crowded boardroom. I have conditions, I said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. He'd been expecting this. Of course you do. If we do this, you tell me things. Not everything, but the things that affect me. No managing information to manage my reactions. I'm not a junior associate you're protecting from volatility. I stopped. You're my equal, he said simply. In the ways that matter. Yes, agreed, and you let me build something of my own. I'll transition the role. I can train someone 3 months. I have a candidate in mind already. You have a candidate in mind. Divya's been underutilized in IR for 2 years and she's wasted there. She'd be exceptional in this position and you know it. I held his gaze, and when I'm independent, we're partners. Not employer and former employee. Partners. He was quiet for a moment. Agreed, he said. To all of it. Don't agree just because you want to. I'm agreeing because you're right. He said it with perfect steadiness. On all points. The power dynamic required this resolution. I'd arrived at the same conclusion from a different direction. A pause. Slower than you, apparently. You had other things on your mind. Thomas Egan. Among other things. He reached out and took my hand, which was so quiet and so different from everything I'd expected that I didn't have a ready response for it. He just held it, like the gesture was its own complete sentence. When this resolves, he said, fully resolves, when Egan is handled, and the OSC has what they need, and you've transitioned the role, I'd like to take you somewhere quiet. Not a work, dinner, not a client event. Somewhere that's just... Yes. Outside, Bay Street hummed 38 floors below. Somewhere a filing was being prepared that would effectively end Thomas Egan's current career trajectory, and redirect him, hopefully, toward choices with better long-term outcomes. The quarterly report was sitting on my desk half-finished. Divya was probably at her desk in IR right now with no idea her life was about to get significantly more interesting. "Okay," I said. He looked at me. "Okay, but I'm finishing the Q3 report tonight. It goes to the LPs on Friday." Something in his expression broke open into what was unmistakably a real smile, not the corner-of-the-mouth version, an actual smile, and it changed his entire face in a way I found deeply inconvenient, given that I was trying to maintain professional composure. "Obviously," he said. "The next 8 weeks were complicated in exactly the ways we'd anticipated, and a few we hadn't. The OSC inquiry expanded based on the pattern of contact documentation. Thomas Egan's firm retained outside counsel. There were 2 weeks where my name appeared in documents I was told not to worry about by 3 separate lawyers, which is exactly what you say to someone when they should be worried. I was not technically worried. I was tracking every development in a color-coded spreadsheet and updating Adrian daily, with a level of calm thoroughness that I privately considered my finest professional work. He called me one evening when I was working from home, the space heater going, tea cooling on the desk beside me. "You've been managing me," he said without preamble. "I've been giving you accurate, well-organized information on a consistent basis. You've been making it look less serious than it is so I don't make reactive decisions. I considered this. That's a more accurate description. Yes. Lily, you were about to fly to Ottawa and have a conversation with someone at the regulatory body that your legal team had specifically advised against. It would have resolved faster. It would have created a conflict of interest in the preliminary review and potentially complicated the outcome." I wrapped both hands around my mug. "I was protecting the outcome you actually want, not the one that felt satisfying in the moment." He was quiet. "I'm not used to being handled." "I know, you're doing very well." Another silence. Then, quiet. "Thank you. For what specifically? For this. All of it. For staying in this with me instead of stopped. This isn't an easy situation to be adjacent to. You didn't create it. My firm did. By existing and competing and being worth targeting." He paused. "I'm this business for 15 years and I know how these things go. Someone always pays a cost that isn't entirely their fault. Adrian." I set down the mug. "I'm fine. The situation is resolving correctly. And for what it's worth, watching you navigate this without going to Ottawa and having the ill-advised conversation has been genuinely impressive." High praise. From me, yes. He made a sound that might, in anyone else, have been a laugh. The resolution came on a Wednesday in December, which felt appropriately anticlimactic. The OSC matter was formally referred forward with Voss Capital, named as a cooperating party rather than a subject. Thomas Egan's firm faced professional regulatory sanctions. Adrian received a call from legal at 4 in the afternoon, came out of his office at 4:15, and stood at my desk with an expression I'd never seen before, uncomplicated relief. "It's done," he said. "I know. I saw the filing update 20 minutes ago." He stared at me. "I set up an alert," I said. "I've been monitoring the OSC disclosure calendar." "Of course you have." He sat in the chair across from my desk, the one usually reserved for clients. "Divya starts the transition on January 3rd. I know. I finalized the onboarding plan this morning. I turned my monitor so he could see the screen. 12 weeks, structured handoff. I'll stay consultatively available for the first quarter while I build out my own client pipeline." He looked at the plan, then he looked at me. "I've been working on it for a while," I said. "Contingency planning. In case this worked out. In case we were both serious. Were you uncertain?" I thought about it honestly. I was uncertain whether you'd be able to stop managing me long enough to actually be with me. They're different skill sets. He held my gaze. "And now? You didn't go to Ottawa. That's the bar. It's a meaningful data point." He stood. For a moment he just looked at me across the desk. 14 months of careful professional distance, of flat whites and single-page memos and 7 corrections, and 100 small gestures I'd catalogued and called something other than what they were. "Friday evening," he said. "There's a restaurant on Harborfront I've been to once. Quiet, not sceney, good wine. No one we know will be there. That sounds like something you researched." I researched it in August. August, 3 months before the flowers, before Thomas Egan, before any of it became urgent. He'd been thinking about it in August, in the middle of an ordinary quarter, on some unremarkable afternoon. Yes, I said. Friday. The restaurant was everything he'd described. Small, unpretentious, the kind of place that had been on harborfront for 20 years without becoming a destination. We sat at a corner table and talked for 3 hours, and it was strange and easy in equal measure, the way things are when you know someone very well in one context and are learning them in another. He told me about his grandfather, who'd immigrated from Krakow in the 70s and built a small, commercial property business from nothing, who'd taught Adrian chess on a board with a cracked queen that they'd never replaced because his grandfather said you had to learn to play with imperfect pieces. He told me about the year he'd almost left finance entirely to do a land and water law program at Dalhousie, and about the conversation with a mentor who'd convinced him that capital could do environmental work if you were deliberate about where you deployed it, which was how Voss Capital had ended up with a significant green infrastructure portfolio that nobody who read the financial press coverage would have predicted. I told him about Guelph and the specific texture of growing up in a city that was big enough to have ambitions but small enough that everyone knew what you were reaching for. About my mother, who'd taught high school math for 30 years and had opinions about analytical rigor that I'd apparently internalized completely. About the $2,000 and the reference letter and the stubbornness my brother still called annoying. He's right, Adrian said. It's annoying. It's also the reason you're here. The stubbornness or the $2,000? Both, the combination. He refilled my wine glass. For what it's worth, the first time I thought about this seriously, about wanting something beyond a professional relationship, was the memo. The harbor front memo. Mo. You wrote it in a way that assumed I would act correct information, not hoped. Assumed. He looked at me across the table. That's a kind of trust that's hard to earn from me and harder to explain to people who haven't seen it. I know. You knew it when you wrote it. I knew you were worth the bet. He was quiet for a moment, something working through his expression that I was learning to read in this new context. Not the professional composure, but the actual face underneath it, which was less controlled and considerably warmer. I'd like to be worth the bet, he said. I want to be clear that I understand what that requires. This won't always be uncomplicated. I know. I've seen your calendar. You work 14-hour days during Q4, and you have opinions about everything. I have informed positions. You have opinions. I kept my expression neutral. It's okay. I also have opinions. It's going to be a significant adjustment for both of us. This got me the full smile again. It still did something inconvenient to my composure. The months that followed were exactly what we'd agreed. Genuine partnership built inside a genuine life, which turned out to be less seamless and more real than either version we'd imagined. I built my consulting practice out of my apartment at first, then a shared office space on Adelaide, 3 clients by April, 6 by June, work I was proud of in a way that was different from the pride of doing someone else's work well. Divya was, as I'd predicted, extraordinary in the EA role. She called me twice in the first month with questions, and then not at all, which was exactly the right outcome. Adrian and I navigated the adjustment with the particular combination of patience and bluntness that turned out to be our natural register. He was, as I'd suspected, not easy to be with in all the ordinary ways. He had strong feelings about how to load a dishwasher. He read financial news at the breakfast table and wanted to discuss it. He was slow to change his mind and thorough about it once he did. I was particular about my workspace and deeply resistant to being told what to do, and occasionally disappeared into a problem for 4 hours without surfacing, which he found tolerable but noted. We figured it out. Not perfectly, but honestly. His grandfather had a photograph on the wall of the house in Krakow where he'd grown up. Adrian told me one evening in the spring, when we were sitting on my small Leslieville backyard, and the tomatoes were doing considerably better than the previous years, because Adrian had opinions about soil composition and drainage that he'd expressed, without being asked. The photograph was of his grandmother, young, on a street Adrian didn't recognize, looking at something outside the frame. His grandfather had taken it in 1963, before they were married. He'd kept it his entire life, had it framed, carried it across an ocean. He said the thing about her that made him certain, Adrian said, was that she never needed him to make sense of the world. She was already doing that for herself. He just wanted to be part of the world she was making sense of. I looked at him. You've been waiting to say that for a while. Approximately 4 months. It's a good line. It's true. He was watching me with that steady quality I'd long since stopped trying to look away from. You were already making sense of everything before I was part of it. I just wanted to be part of it. Yes. The tomatoes were coming in red and heavy, revenge for the squirrels of the previous year. The city hummed beyond the backyard fence. Somewhere on Bay Street, in a 38th-floor office, Divya was probably answering emails with the particular efficient grace that I'd spent 14 months accidentally teaching her. I reached over and took his hand, the same way he'd taken mine in that office in October. Quietly, like the gesture was its own complete sentence. You already are, I said.